Good morning, everyone, and welcome to How Stratas Can Get Low Carbon Fuel Credits for EV Charging. My name is Wendy Wall. I am the president of the Vancouver Island Strata Owners Association, based here in Victoria. And I want to say, I always look out my window. It's a gorgeous day out there, and I'm so grateful to live in the territories of the Lekwungen speaking peoples, which if you're in this area, you know that it is the Esquimalt and Songhees First Nations. Also want to acknowledge we are really grateful for the financial support of the province of British Columbia through the Ministry of Energy, Mines and Low Carbon Innovation. They were able to fund getting the word out for this webinar today. So we're very grateful for that. And some people are wondering, well, why am I giving this webinar? We really wanted, what we found is that the low carbon fuel credits are just not well known yet. A lot of stratas don't know that they exist. And we thought, just strata owner to strata owner, let's try to explain what is some fairly complex legislation, but break it down to a way that we as strata owners find it accessible. So today we're going to cover the legislation. So we'll talk about the low carbon fuel standard briefly. You're here to find out, are you eligible for low carbon fuel credits as a strata corporation? How can the credits benefit your strata? And then the nitty-gritty, reporting requirements, how you receive the credits, and then monetizing them. Are you going to work with a third party? Are you going to go on your own and use what's called a TFRS account? We're going to go into that. And then at the end, what can you do with the money under the Strata Property Act? So starting off with the legislation. One of the objectives of the Ministry of Energy, Mines and Low Carbon Innovation is to deliver quality programs and incentives that encourage British Columbians to choose greener homes, buildings, and transportation. So I'm here today to talk about transportation, or more specifically, EV charging in strata corporations. And I will go into detail about this one incentive, which is the low carbon fuel credits. And as you'll see today, they are substantial. So in the transportation sector, we tend to think of fuel as being gasoline or diesel, but electricity is also a fuel. When we switch to electric vehicles, it is the whole point of fuel switching is to contribute to BC's goals of reducing carbon intensity of transportation fuels. So the legislation in BC sets out these goals and the requirements to achieve them. And on January 1st, 2024, they launched the Low Carbon Fuels Act, and two sets of regulations came into effect. They replaced the previous legislation and regulations, and together these pieces of law are known as the Low Carbon Fuel Standard. So rather than mention all of the act and regulations today by name, I'm just going to refer to them collectively as the Low Carbon Fuel Standard. So what does the Low Carbon Fuel Standard set out? Well, it, among other things, it sets out the requirements for suppliers of diesel and gasoline to reduce their average carbon intensity of their fuels annually. And the goal is to achieve a 30% reduction by 2030. Now that's compared to the 2010 levels. I just have to mention the word suppliers. The wording is actually a bit more detailed in the law. It says suppliers, marketers, or persons responsible for fuel through an allocation agreement. You don't have to remember all that. For simplicity, today I'm just going to refer to them collectively as suppliers. So another thing that the standard sets out is the reporting requirements and administrative penalties. It also, this is the part that you want to know, it sets out the eligibility for credits, how the credits are calculated, and then the requirements for reporting those credits after they're traded. What you really want to know is, are you eligible for these credits? So to be eligible for credits, your strata corporation, or actually any building owner like a co-op, housing association, or if you're a landlord that owns a purpose-built rental building, any of those entities, you have to pass 3 tests. So we're going to go into these in detail, but just to summarize, you have to pass the test of who supplies the electricity to what they call final supply equipment. Final supply equipment is just another way of naming charging stations. So again, as laypersons, let's just call them charging stations today. And the reason is it's because the stations are the final point. It's the final piece of equipment through which electricity is being provided to an electric vehicle. It's a long way of saying it. So the second test is, can the electricity be measured accurately? And then the third test is, does the building have 5 or more dwelling units? So test number 1, who supplies the electricity? So today we're talking about electricity that is supplied to those charging stations by the Strata Corporation. It's common electricity. So that would be that the Strata Corporation is the one who receives the bill from BC Hydro or Fortis and then pays it from the operating fund. From that particular bill, that invoice, some or all of the electricity is being supplied to the EV charging stations. So we're not talking about the bill that's billed directly to an owner. We're talking about the common expense of the strata. So if the answer is yes to this question, then we get to move on to test number 2. Can the electricity be measured accurately? So the legislation requires that fuel suppliers have to register every single one of those charging stations and then report the total electrical consumption annually. So it's not, you don't have to report per station, it's just the total of all stations. So the Strata Corporation has to make sure it has a system that will ensure an accurate and reliable measurement of the quantity of electricity that is provided to those charging stations. This could be a reading from a BC Hydro meter that is exclusively for the charging stations. It could be a revenue grade meter. Some charging stations are capable of tracking the data, or you might have a networked system that collects the data for the consumption from every station, and then it gets totaled. The point is, it can't be an estimate or a guess. By law, it has to be accurate. And if you can pass this test, then we're going to go on to number 3. So does the building have 5 or more dwelling units? In the strata world, we tend to think of our strata corporations by the total number of strata lots. But when looking at the requirements of the low carbon fuel standard, we have to consider how many residential buildings our strata has. Many of you will be from stratas that have multiple buildings. And how many residential units are in each of those buildings? This act calls them dwelling units. So if your entire strata has fewer than 5 dwelling units, then you know clearly your strata fails the test. If you have 5 or more in a single building, then that building passes the test. If every residential building has 5 or more dwelling units, then again, the strata passes the test. But some residential buildings have fewer than 5 units, and some have more. So there is an area there where, you know, a case-by-case basis, does it pass the test? Of course, a strata, we would typically supply electricity to charging stations located on common property, not specifically tied to being used at a building. So if your strata has some buildings that are fewer than 5 dwelling units and some that are more, it can be a bit confusing to know how to interpret this requirement. So I do encourage that some of these cases will have to be looked at on an individual basis. To make it more complicated, there's also situations where an individual owner might qualify as a supplier if their unit is in a building that has 5 or more dwelling units. This needs to be looked at on a case-by-case basis as well. And as you'll see later in the webinar, in practice, getting and selling credits for a single station, a single owner, it does come with challenges. So to recap, credits are not available for stratas that have EV charging that takes place at a building that contains fewer than 5 dwelling units. And if the EV charging is taking place at a residential building that contains 5 or more dwelling units, then the strata is the fuel supplier. However, the strata is only the fuel supplier if it passes all 3 tests. So how can these credits benefit your strata? Now that you have an idea of whether your strata might qualify, we're going to think about this as a source of revenue, and all sources of revenue that the strata gets go to pay your operating expenses. So this could be for insurance or your gardener or elevator. So the idea here is that when your owners understand that there could be revenue coming in from low carbon fuel credits, and that this money might help reduce their strata fees, or it might help you increase your contributions to your contingency reserve fund, owners are going to be more likely to support projects to install EV charging infrastructure. You've likely heard the term EV ready. So that's one example of installing infrastructure. And EV ready means an electrical installation of everything that's needed up to the point of a parking stall, which means it's easier for each owner to have a charging station installed at that parking space in the future. It's basically being attached to a system that's already in place. Of course, there's a process, and the owner would have to get permission and be in compliance with the Strata Property Act, but that just gives you an idea of how these credits could be motivators. So we all like the idea of a new revenue stream. How many credits could you get, and how much are they worth? What's the value of a credit? You don't have to worry about how credits are calculated. The formulas are complicated because they apply to all sorts of fuel, like electricity, gas, hydrogen, even jet fuel. And they include a lot of complicated terms like carbon intensity and energy content and effectiveness ratio. You don't have to worry about any of that. The formulas are actually set in the regulations by law, and the government system automatically calculates the number of credits that a fuel supplier gets. And again, that's based on the amount of electricity that's being supplied to those charging stations. So let's look at some examples of, try to figure out how many credits the strata might reasonably get from supplying electricity to those stations. So how much does the average driver actually use in terms of electricity? According to Natural Resources Canada, drivers in BC typically drive about 13,000 kilometers per year. And depending on the make and model of the vehicle, and depending on the driving habits of that person, that takes about 2,300 or 2,000 kilowatt hours of electricity per year. So if that driver were doing all their charging at home and the strata supplied the electricity to that station, that equals roughly 2 credits for that driver. The next question you want to know is, how much are the credits worth? Well, the price fluctuates because credits are traded in a credit market. But the government publishes credit market data every quarter. So every 3 months, you can go in there and you can see how much things are trading for. And you'll see that the average trading prices have increased steadily over the years. In 2023, the average trading price was $472 per credit. But there's also a minimum and maximum. So the lowest amount in the trades was $200 a credit, and the maximum was 510. So in the past, trades have been in large volumes because you can imagine you're dealing with large oil and gas companies who are trying to buy these low carbon fuel credits. However, speaking with the ministry, they say that last year they were starting to see some transfers with smaller volumes. If we look at the actual average last year, the average size of a single trade was 6,700 credits. So if you only have 6 or 10 or 20 credits, just keep that volume in mind. And let's look at a little example. If the strata had 10 drivers, the strata could potentially earn, let's say, 20 credits. At the average price of trading last year, that would equal about $9,400. So you can see that these credits are worthwhile. They're worth pursuing if you are supplying electricity to those charging stations. We're going to talk a little bit later about trading in the trading market because there could be fees involved. But it kind of gives you an idea that this could be a significant source of revenue for your strata. So now we get into reporting and getting those credits. So this is the nitty-gritty. So getting money for your credits, it involves two main steps. First, there's a requirement to submit a compliance report. So this is the key point of this legislation, is that someone needs to report the amount of electricity that has gone to those charging stations because it is a low carbon transportation fuel. Once that report has been in and the credits have been given, then the next step is those credits have to be monetized. So they have to be traded or sold on the credit market for you to get money out of them. So the reporting is a requirement by law. It has to be reported each year. And as I said, it's the total, it's the aggregate amount of electricity that has been supplied to all charging stations on the strata property. I should say, of all electricity supplied by the Strata Corporation. And the compliance period is the calendar year, January 1st to December 31st. And then you have until the following March to submit the compliance report. So here's where it gets a little bit interesting. While submitting the report is a legal requirement, if you're a small strata and you only have a few EV drivers and you don't want any credits, you don't have to report, but you wouldn't get any credits. However, there is a legal requirement if you're supplying more electricity. So if you're supplying more than 15,000 kilowatt hours of electricity to those charging stations, then there is a legal requirement to report. And failure to report could result in administrative penalties. But why wouldn't you want to report? Because you want to be eligible for those credits. So I'm going to come back to this a couple of times today. If you have less up to 15,000 kilowatt hours, you can't report on your own, but you can go through a third party. If you supply 15,000 or more, you have two choices. You can either allocate the responsibility for the reporting and handling the credits to a third party, or you can use what's called the TFRS system. It's called the Transportation Fuels Reporting System. But we're going to cycle back to that because most of you are from small stratas. You're not going to have more than 15,000 kilowatt hours of electricity yet, but just be aware of this because over the years, the amount that you're supplying is likely going to grow. So today I am going to focus mostly on working with a third party through an allocation agreement. The strata would enter into an allocation agreement with a third party, with this aggregator. And then what the aggregator does is they take all of this reporting from all of those small clients and they pool the amount of electricity they're going to report. And they have to, of course, wait until they have more than 15,000 kilowatt hours to report, but then they can submit one report and they can get the credits from the ministry. And so this makes it a simplified process for small suppliers like a strata corporation. They're going to record the sale, and then what they have to do is go into the system and they're going to transfer those credits to the purchaser. But the aggregator does all of this. You wouldn't have to worry about it if you had an agreement with an aggregator. And then it would depend on your contract with them to require them to pay you for those credits. So what is an allocation agreement? Well, it makes another person or another company responsible for your compliance obligations under the law. So remember, there are administrative penalties if the law isn't complied with. So an aggregator that you have a contract with is taking on all of that legal responsibility. They're taking on the risk of administrative penalties if it's not done right. So, you know, the aggregators are going to know the law and the regulations very well because they're taking on the risk. So as you'll see, there are very detailed requirements and there's a base amount of admin work, regardless of whether you're asking your aggregator to sell one credit or thousands of credits. The regulations do have a long list of requirements of what needs to be in an allocation agreement. I've just done a few bullets here to keep it simple. But obviously it has to have the contact information for each party. In our case, it's going to be between the aggregator and our strata corporation. It needs to have the details of every single charging station. So there's a serial number and there's a longitude and latitude of where that station is located. But your aggregator knows all of those details that you need and can help you through that process. The regulation also says that the term of the contract can't be more than 3 years. So that's an important one for us as Stratas to know how long we're in our contracts. There's also a requirement in the regulations that the aggregator tell you how many credits they receive from the ministry and what the fair market value of those credits is on the date that they were issued to the aggregator. So now I'm going to go back to that 15,000 kilowatt hours threshold. So what happens if you're supplying more than 15,000 kilowatt hours? If you recall, I was saying that you have a choice. So if you're supplying that larger quantity, you can choose to allocate your responsibility to a third party, the aggregator we were just talking about, or you can go on your own and report through the transportation fuel reporting system. So I'm going to call it a TFRS account just for short. And in that account, it's an online portal. You submit the compliance report every year, receive the credits from the ministry. Then you'd have to go sell them. And you come back and you record the sale of the credits. And then you transfer the credits in the system from you to whoever, the company that purchased them. Again, it's usually a large oil and gas company, something like that. But remember, and this is important, TFRS is not a system for selling your credits. It's only a system for recording the transaction. So you still have to find a purchaser. You still have to find someone to buy those credits. And then once you've sold them, you come back to TFRS, you record the sale, and you transfer the credits to that purchaser. I'm going to come back to what we talked about earlier. Keep in mind, if you only have 6 or 10 or 20 credits, sorry, it would be more credits than that because of the 15,000 kilowatts an hour, but it's still going to be well under 100 credits. The average transactions in 2023 were 6,000 credits. So, you know, between 3 and 10,000. So doing it on your own, you just have to realize that you could be dealing with a very low volume of credits. But if you want to do it, there's three main steps to getting your TFRS account. The first thing you would need to do is to get what's called a BCEID for your strata corporation. So that's not like our personal BCEIDs, it's a business BCEID. It's a little different for strata corporations because the system isn't set up for stratas. It's built more for business corporations and societies and things like that. Once you've done that, you submit what's called a Form A, and it's a TFRS registration form. And then the next step would be registering all of your charging stations. Again, they call them final supply equipment, so there's a form to do this. And again, it's going to be the serial number, the longitude and latitude. There's columns in an Excel sheet that you would have to fill out, and that gets submitted to the ministry. And then they would give you your TFRS account, which, like I said, it's an online portal. You'd log in and you do these steps. But you wouldn't have an aggregator helping you through these steps. So there are resources on the ministry's website. There are forms and there are user guides. So on the ministry's webpage, it's called the Renewable and Low Carbon Fuel webpage. So you can get some resources here, the FSE identification form. So again, that's the form for registering all the information about each charging station. There is a user guide to help you if you want to set up that business BCEID. There is the Form A that we talked about, the TFRS registration form. And then there's a user guide for using the TFRS portal. Going back to that choice, do you want to do it through a TFRS account or do you want to have a third party where you allocate? So just to let you know that if you do allocate to a third party, you don't need a BCEID and you don't need a TFRS account because your aggregator has a TFRS account. So that just gives you an idea of the two different types of processes. One is simpler and just what's right for you. Which process would you like to go through? Now, this is a question that's come up a lot lately, is what can the strata do with the money? So when there's a trade of credits where the strata was the supplier of the electricity, the money that's received from trading those credits belongs to the strata corporation. It's general revenue. It's just like when you sell a key or a fob, when you collect interest, when you rent a parking stall, that's all general revenue. And of course, that means that it can be used to pay all of your general operating expenses. So that could be insurance, it could be utilities, it could pay for gardening or janitorial, whatever your general revenue goes to. And so I think the best practice here is that when you're preparing your annual budget and you're getting ready for your AGM, it's your proposed budget that's going to be voted on at your AGM. If it's a year where you're expecting that you're going to monetize some credits, in your lines of revenue, strata fees, interest, renting parking stalls, add a line. Add a line for revenue for low carbon fuel credits. Now, a budget is a budget. It's an estimate. So you're not going to know the exact amount of what those low carbon fuel credits will be sold for. So you just put in an estimated revenue. And you can look at the credit market data report to get an idea of what they were trading for in the last quarter or the last year. And that gives you an idea. And what I've heard a lot is some people being worried that they have to reconcile exactly what's coming in from those credits against electricity that's been paid. That's not the way our budget works. We have general revenue and we have operating expenses. And the only reconciling is at the end of the year, we look at the final. Are we in a surplus or are we in a deficit? So if you're in a surplus, you just look at the Strata Property Act, Section 105, and it tells you, here's your options of what you can do with a surplus. And that's a surplus of the entire operating budget. If you're in a deficit, same thing. Strata Property Act Section 105 tells you how to deal with a deficit. So what are your next steps now that you've figured out whether you're eligible or not for these credits? I want you to remember that it is almost March 31st. So if you were a fuel supplier in the year of 2023, if you supplied electricity to charging stations anytime between January 1st and December 31st, 2023, there's a requirement to report that electricity that was supplied to the charging stations, and the deadline is March 31st. So if you haven't done that yet, you might want to reach out to a professional like an aggregator to help you get those in time. Because if you miss the deadline, then you've missed the opportunity to get your credits. So you can learn more. The government website URL was very long, so I made a short one here, but it takes you to the low carbon fuel credits webpage, and I had described all of the resources there. You can also go to Visoa's website, where we have a whole page for electric vehicle charging in Stratas, and we will be adding some resources there shortly about aggregators and selling credits, just so that you have a resource to help you through. But just remember, if you are supplying 15,000 kilowatt hours of electricity or more per year, the Strata has a legal obligation to make sure that that electricity is reported. And there is the risk of administrative penalties if you're in non-compliance. So I think as a Strata corporation, it's really important to decide what process you're going to use, who is going to be responsible for that process, to make sure that you don't miss the deadlines, not only for the reporting requirement, but also so you don't miss out on your credits. You can also contact by email. The Low Carbon Fuels branch has this email address, lcfs@gov.bc.ca, or you can contact Visoa at evcharging@visoa.bc.ca. Again, we'd really like to thank the province of British Columbia for their financial support in putting on this webinar, and that is through the Ministry of Energy, Mines and Low Carbon Innovation. Thank you everyone for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed this webinar. If you'd like to watch the video at a later time, please visit Visoa's video channel on YouTube. It's just called Visoa Videos. Thank you all and have a good day.